Welcome to the Word Book by Book. Today, we will be looking at the shortest book in the Old Testament, the book of Obadiah, minor prophet. Minor does not mean unimportant, it just means it is a short book compared to the generally longer sections, which are also called as major prophets. To set this up, I read this week about God and the enemies. Does God have enemies? Think about this question for a minute. One kind of Muslim will answer that question as, yes, God's enemies are Israelites and Americans. For a Hindu nationalist, they will say, yes, it is Muslims and Christians. Having enemies is not something God does, right? People have enemies, sure, but not God. It is true that people do have enemies. We see it in news every day. For instance, the terrible thing that happened on September 11 reminds us humans simply make enemies of one another. Recent mass shooting in Uvalde taking the lives of children reminds us this world is broken. The book of Obadiah is a story of Israel and Edom. The other prophets speak to Old Testament believers and to Christians and churches, but Obadiah proclaimed a vision from the God to the people who knew nothing about theology and who had no place for the knowledge of God in their lives. He spoke to society much like our own society. On one level, the book of Obadiah is a pronouncement of doom against an ancient and long forgotten nation, the land of Edom. The Edomites had killed, captured, and exploited Jewish refugees who tried to escape the sword of their Babylonian conquerors. God has disciplined Israel by allowing Babylon to lead the nation into captivity. Though God disciplined Israel, he was angry with Edom for gloating over the sufferings of his people. So God, through Obadiah, issued this message of judgment against Edom. In this shortest book, we will learn about who God is, who his friends are, and who his enemies are. Even if it was written long ago, we will find rich treasures of truth in this little book. The name Obadiah means the servant of Jehovah, and he truly fulfills the role of servant. Ray Stedman in his commentary says, Obadiah comes, does his work, delivers his message, then fades into the mist of history. I'm going to divide this book in 3 sections, picking this from Ray Stedman's commentary again. Judgment pronounced against Edom. This is the first section from verses 1 through 14. The second section is the result of judgment from verses from 15 through 18, and then Israel to possess Edom, 19 through 21. Why did God announce judgment against Edom? Is Edom God's enemy? Who are God's enemies? From the first section of the book of Obadiah, we see proud people are God's enemies. In verse 3, we see the pride of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights, you who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Just to give you a glimpse of Edom, remember the story in Genesis? Edomites share the same ancestry and belong to Abraham and Sarah. So with their son Isaac and his wife Rebekah has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. These 2 brothers have a very tense relationship. They each later received the names Israel and Edom. So Israel and Edomites have these family tensions happening all over. So Edomites believed that they are superior to the Israelites. Pride is what God is not happy with. And the Lord said, speaking through the prophet, that the pride of their hearts deceived them. The trouble with Edom is pride. With our pastor, we're studying these days the book of Proverbs, and in chapter 11, verse 2, we see when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. In the same book, chapter 16, we see pride goes before destruction. In verse 4 of Obadiah, we see God saying, "Though you soar like the eagles and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord." So pride goes before destruction. Jesus' life is full of humility, and he said he came to earth not to be served, but to be the servant. A closer look in this section will help us to see the opponents of God's people from verses 5 through 16. Here we see not only God opposing the proud, but those who opposes his people. God promises that the proud will be humbled, and he abhors the nation who treats other people as if those people belong to the nation rather than God. God will not like when people persecute his own children. Jesus makes this very clear after his resurrection when he appeared to the Saul and said to Saul, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" So God restates his promise to destroy Edom, but in much more explicit terms. "In that day, declares the Lord," which is in verse 8. In verses from 11 through 15, we see Obadiah explaining more fully the nature of Edom's violence against Israel. Part of their violence was simply to comply with the violence of others. In all of this, the book of Obadiah foreshadows the figure of Herod, who we know from extra-biblical literature was the descendant of the Edomites. He attacked the infants in Bethlehem, attempting to kill God's chosen one. So after looking at two different kinds of enemies, it is said to be true, if there was an enemy, then there's also a friend. So who are God's friends? The final section of the book of Obadiah answers this question. In verse 13 of Obadiah, we see that God called Israelites my people. We see two dimensions of God from this minor prophet. We not only see that God is the judge of all who are proud and who opposes his people, he teaches that God is a friend for his people. He cares for the people. Amid God's words of judgment against Edom, God also speaks words of hope for his people. Not only would the wicked receive justice, but God's people also would be restored. We see that God will make Mount Zion holy again, and that he will dwell with his people. Finally, at the end of the last verse, I would like to unpack who is God. In Obadiah, verse 21, we see, "And the kingdom will be the Lord's kingdom." God's kingship is the real message of this little book. No one can replace God from the throne. He is the king. Pharisees and the teachers of the law tried to do that. Satan tried to defeat God, and death tried to conquer him and his kingdom. But God, Jesus Christ, can never be replaced from his throne. Who are you? Think about it. Are you an enemy of God or a friend of God? Bible teaches us, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." We are, by very nature, enemies to God. But God sent his Son to restore the humanity from sin. We are more than conquerors through Christ. We are his people. We are his friends.